The beast and the boy. The shuttle fell from the sky like a wounded bird. It tore through the upper clouds and slammed into the wild green moon called Vereen. Mason woke to smoke and silence. His ship was gone, half buried in the mud, and the air smelled of iron and wet moss. His visor blinked warnings, but the oxygen was good enough to breathe. He dragged himself free and stared at the jungle stretching beyond the crash site. The trees were tall like towers, their roots coiled around boulders that pulsed faintly with blue light. Somewhere in that jungle something roared, low and long, shaking the ground under his boots. He had read about that sound before. The locals called it the nightmaw. The apex predator of Vereen. On the other side of the same valley, an alien scout stood in her own moment of silence. Leery of House Vess watched the smoke plume and tightened the straps of her exo-armor. She had been sent here to prove her worth as a hunter. The Vess believed that only by killing a nightmaw could one earn the mark of adulthood. She had tracked one for days but had not found its nest. Now she saw the fire from the human crash and smiled bitterly. Humans always brought chaos wherever they fell. She lifted her pulse rifle and descended toward the smoke mason was trying to salvage gear when he heard the click of boots behind him. He turned and saw her. Tall, scaled slightly along her jaw, violet eyes glowing in the dim light. She pointed the rifle at him and spoke in harsh Vessian. He raised his hands and said slowly that he was not an enemy. The translator on her wrist blinked and repeated his words in her tongue. She lowered the weapon only slightly and said he should leave because a nightmaw was near. He said he could not. His shuttle beacon needed time to charge. Before they could argue more, the jungle went silent again. Every small creature vanished into burrows. The mist thickened. A shape moved through the ferns, low, wide, graceful, each step making no sound. Lyrie froze. The nightmaw was here. Its body shimmered black and blue, scales rippling with shifting patterns like liquid armor. Eyes like molten amber locked onto them. She raised her rifle, but Mason caught her wrist. He whispered no. She looked at him in disbelief. The beast moved closer, scenting the air. Mason dropped his pack slowly and crouched down. He extended an open palm toward the ground, then lowered his head. His voice came out soft and steady as he murmured something in old Terran field language, a tone used to calm big cats back on Earth. The nightmaw paused. Its muscles twitched. It could kill both in one leap, but it did not. It sniffed again. The air carried no fear from the human, only calm, steady breath. The beast's tail flicked once, and then it turned away into the trees, vanishing like smoke. Lyrie exhaled sharply. She stared at Mason as if seeing a ghost. No creature of Vereen ever ignored prey, and no human ever faced a nightmaw and lived. She demanded to know what trick he had used. He said quietly it was not a trick, but respect. Predators know when they are feared. Sometimes respect changes the meaning of the hunt. Lyrie did not believe him, but her mind was shaken. She had spent her whole life being told the nightmaw was pure death. Yet this man had faced it without a weapon and survived. She watched him gather fragments of his beacon and start repairing it with patience that seemed impossible under such danger. She said that staying would get him killed. He answered that leaving without understanding would waste the moment. He wanted to learn why the beast had not attacked. Lyrie frowned, but something in her heart told her to stay a little longer. She told herself it was for safety, not curiosity. They made a small camp in the clearing. Mason built a quiet fire using plasma gel. Lyrie scanned the perimeter and kept glancing at the shadows where the nightmaw had vanished. She finally asked why humans would study a killer instead of killing it first. He told her that on his world humans had once hunted every predator, until they learned that fear alone was not survival. Wolves became partners, horses became friends. It took patience and trust. She listened but did not answer. When night fell, the jungle came alive again with distant roars. The nightmaw's voice echoed across the valley like thunder through bone. Hours later, Lyrie woke to a faint rustle. The beast had returned. It stood at the edge of the firelight, eyes reflecting the orange flame. Mason did not move. He reached into his pack and pulled a dried fruit ration, tossing it gently to the ground between them. The beast sniffed it and growled softly, a low sound like grinding stone. It did not eat, but after a moment it dropped something near the fruit, a piece of bone carved into a crescent shape. Then it melted back into the trees. Lyrie's mouth went dry. The nightmaw had given something in return. When the jungle settled again, she whispered that maybe the beast had chosen them. Mason smiled faintly and said maybe it had just learned to trust. Lyrie looked at the bone talisman gleaming by the fire and wondered if her people's stories had ever been wrong. The moonlight slid across the valley and the sound of the beast's distant call rolled once more through the air, deep and strange, almost like it was calling a name neither of them yet knew. Trust test morning came in a gray mist that clung to the trees like a living thing. Mason woke first and stirred the ashes of their fire until a small flame came alive again. The alien moon was quiet except for the soft hum of insects and the distant rumble of something large moving through the forest. Leary opened her eyes and saw Mason kneeling by the fire, studying a small map projected from his wristpad. His calm face looked strange to her, almost unreal, because he had seen the night maw up close and lived, and yet his heartbeat remained steady. She wanted to understand how that was possible. He offered her a ration bar without saying anything, and she took it with a nod. For a while they ate in silence until she asked what he had learned from the encounter. He said the night maw had been curious but not hungry. Maybe it was testing them, maybe it had cubs nearby. Leary frowned because her people's record said the night maw was a solitary beast that killed anything near its territory. Mason only smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes records are wrong when written by those who never looked close enough." They started walking deeper into the forest. Mason carried a scanner and recorded the tracks on the ground. The footprints were massive but careful, claws retracted, the gait showing balance, not rage. He pointed at the stride and told Leary this was a pattern of a creature that did not waste energy, one that thought before moving. He explained that on Earth predators like wolves or lions had similar patterns when guarding young or hunting for food, but not for fun. Leary kept silent, but her tail twitched as she watched him kneel to examine the dirt. He seemed more like a patient observer than a survivor. She wondered if humans were all like him, or if this one was just mad. Still, she followed. They came to a shallow stream where the water glowed faintly from minerals. Mason knelt and washed his hands. He told her predators could smell blood and fear and that he needed to keep his scent clean. She scoffed and said no amount of washing could hide the scent of a human on this moon. Mason looked up and said maybe not, but sometimes showing effort mattered more than success. The night maw might see it as a gesture of peace. Leary studied his face and saw that he truly believed it. In her culture, peace with predators was weakness, but she began to sense a kind of strength in the way he refused to draw his weapon. That night they set up camp on a ridge overlooking the valley. Mason built a small circle of glowing beacons, not as traps but as markers to signal their location in a non-threatening way. Leary watched the trees below sway in the night wind. She told Mason stories of her people's first settlers on Vereen, how they fought the night maws for generations until the beasts drove them into the highlands. Every child of House Vess grew up hearing tales of burned villages and shattered armor, and every young warrior dreamed of the day they would kill one and wear its hide as proof of courage. Mason listened quietly, and when she finished he asked if any story ever told what the night maws wanted. Leary hesitated and said they were monsters, they wanted only blood. Mason shook his head and said that sometimes what we call monsters are just mirrors of what we fear. Most late. In the night, they heard heavy footsteps. Leary grabbed her rifle, but Mason raised a hand for silence. The night maw appeared at the edge of the ridge, eyes glowing gold in the firelight. It did not charge. Instead, it sat down, tail curling around its body, watching them from a short distance. Mason reached into his pack and took another ration bar. He placed it on a flat rock halfway between them and stepped back. Leary could not believe what she was seeing. The night maw leaned forward, sniffed the air, then took the bar gently between its teeth. It did not eat it, but dropped it again and released a low rumble that vibrated in their chests. Then it vanished into the trees once more. Leary whispered that this was madness, that beasts did not act like this. Mason said softly that it was learning to test their trust, just as they were testing its. Over the next few days, Mason recorded every encounter. Sometimes they found bones arranged in strange patterns near their camp, as if the beast was leaving signs. Other times they heard its growl echo through the forest, but it never attacked. Mason began to hum softly at night, low tones that matched the rhythm of the jungle. He said sound mattered, that fear had its own music. Leary listened to his humming and felt her heartbeat slow. She began to hum with him, using a melody from her own childhood, a Vessian song that mothers sang to calm hatchlings. The jungle responded with silence, as if even the insects were listening. For a brief moment it felt like the world was breathing with them. One evening they found a clearing filled with broken trees and claw marks. Mason crouched and touched the gouges. He said this was a hunting ground, but not from hunger, From training. Lyrie said nightmaws did not train, they were born perfect hunters. Mason smiled and said no one is born perfect. Even predators learn, just like humans. She stared at him for a long time and finally asked why he cared so much about understanding this creature. He said because understanding means survival without destruction. Humans had nearly wiped out their own world before learning that lesson. Maybe this time they could do better. His words made her chest tighten because somewhere deep inside she wanted to believe that too. That night the nightmaw came again, closer than ever before. Mason did not move as it approached. Its breath was hot and smelled of iron and wet stone. It leaned forward until its snout touched his shoulder. Lyrie could not breathe. The beast sniffed him, then made a sound like a deep sigh and stepped back. Before it left, it dropped something small near the fire, a tuft of dark fur bound with a thin vine. Mason picked it up and said it looked like a token of recognition. Lyrie felt a chill run through her. The nightmaw was communicating with them. She whispered that the beast had chosen them. Mason said maybe it was no longer about choice. Maybe they were already part of its world. When dawn came, Lyrie stood at the ridge watching the sun rise. The nightmaw's distant call echoed again across the valley, but this time it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a name being spoken in a voice older than both their worlds. Lyrie looked at Mason and saw that he was smiling, quiet and certain, as if he had heard it too. She realized that fear was not the only bond between prey and predator. There could also be trust, and once trust began, it could rival hunters. The calm of the valley did not last. The morning light carried the sound of engines and the smell of ozone. Lyrie froze when she recognized the distinct hum of Vessian airskiffs approaching low through the mist. Mason looked up from his scanner and asked what was wrong. She said her people had come. Before Mason could respond, 3 sleek craft cut through the trees and hovered over the clearing, scattering leaves like rain. Warriors in dark armor stepped out, their silver crest glinting under the rising sun. At their head stood a tall figure with the same violet eyes as Lyrie, but colder, sharper. Jalen of House Vess, her cousin and rival, known for his skill with a spear and his hatred for outsiders. Jalen's gaze fell on Mason immediately. He sneered and asked why his cousin stood beside a human trespasser. Lyrie said Mason was under her protection, that he had survived a nightmaw encounter. Jalen laughed and said survival meant luck, not honor. He pointed toward the forest and declared that their house council had decreed the nightmaw of this valley must die, so that House Vess could claim the lowlands. Lyrie's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but Jalen raised his hand. He said the kill would mark the end of the creature's reign and the beginning of her people's glory. Mason stepped forward and said the nightmaw was not their enemy, that it showed signs of intelligence. The warriors laughed at his words. To them, intelligence was a privilege of the civilized. Not of beasts. Jalen ordered his hunters to set sonic traps along the ridge. Mason watched helplessly as they drove spikes into the soil and activated lures that emitted low-frequency pulses meant to disorient large predators. Lyrie tried to argue, but Jalen only told her to remember where her loyalty lay. He accused her of being tainted by human weakness. She clenched her fists but said nothing. Mason put a hand on her shoulder and said quietly that if they did not stop this, the nightmaw would attack in defense, and then everyone would die. She looked into his eyes and saw no fear there, only determination. Against all logic, she believed him. As dusk fell, the traps began to hum, sending invisible waves through the jungle. The birds vanished, the insects fell silent, and the air itself seemed to vibrate. Mason could feel it in his teeth. He told Lyrie that this kind of pressure could drive any creature mad. She said that was exactly what Jalen wanted, to lure it into a rage and strike when it showed itself. They crept away from camp under the cover of darkness, moving toward the ravine where Mason had first seen the beast. The trees groaned in the wind, their leaves shaking as though whispering warnings. In the distance, a roar split the night. The nightmaw was coming. They reached the edge of the ravine just as the beast appeared below, its scales rippling with blue light and fury. It paced restlessly, shaking its head as the sonic pulses tore at its senses. Mason knew the creature was in pain. He had seen elephants react the same way to low-frequency distress back on Earth. Without hesitation, he slid down the slope and began disabling the traps one by one, his hands moving fast. Lyrie followed, covering him with her rifle in case Jalen's scouts noticed. The ground trembled as the nightmaw roared again, its eyes glowing brighter now with pure rage. Mason shouted over the noise that they had to show it. They were not part of the attack. Leary hesitated, then lowered her rifle and stood in the open, arms spread wide. Jalen's voice came over the comms, demanding to know what she was doing. She ignored him. The Nightmaw stopped pacing and looked at her. Mason knelt, pressing his palms flat to the earth in a gesture of surrender. The beast tilted its head. For a moment, everything went still except the rhythmic throb of the sonic traps. Then the Nightmaw leapt onto the ridge and landed just a few paces from Mason, its breath hot and ragged. Lairie's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear. Mason whispered that he needed her to switch off the last trap behind the beast. She nodded and moved slowly, step by step, until her fingers found the control node. With a flick, the sound died. The silence that followed was almost painful. The Nightmaw blinked, its muscles relaxing slightly as the vibration faded from the air. It looked at Mason, then at Leary. For a moment, its gaze softened. But before peace could settle, Jalen and his warriors appeared from the tree line, weapons drawn. Jalen shouted for them to fire. Leary screamed for them to stop. Mason stood between them and the beast, shouting that it was not a monster, that they could prove it had empathy. Jalen spat and said empathy was for the weak. He pointed his rifle and said Leary had one last chance to restore her honor by taking the shot herself. Leary stood trembling. She looked at the Nightmaw, then at Mason. Her cousin's voice carried over the wind, promising exile if she disobeyed. Mason whispered that choice defined a species more than strength ever could. Leary took a deep breath and turned her rifle aside. She said she would not kill what she did not understand. Jalen's eyes widened in fury. He declared her a traitor and signaled his soldiers to advance. Mason raised his hands and shouted for the Nightmaw to run, but instead the beast stepped forward beside them, its massive head lowering in a slow, deliberate motion. It was not fleeing. It was standing with them. The Vest soldiers hesitated, unsure if they faced a beast or something far greater. Jalen snarled and ordered a retreat to regroup, vowing to return at dawn to claim the Nightmaw's head and Leary's life if needed. As the engines of the skiffs faded into the distance, Leary sank to her knees. Mason knelt beside her. The Nightmaw watched them in silence, then turned and walked back into the forest, leaving deep tracks in the soft soil. Mason placed his hand on one of the prints and said, "This was no longer a hunt." This was the beginning of a change. Leary looked at him with tears in her eyes. She said that now her people would call her cursed. Mason said maybe someday they would call her brave instead. Overhead, the stars of Vereen shimmered through the breaking clouds. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the Nightmaw let out a single echoing call, not of anger this time, but of warning. Mason and Leary both knew what it meant. Jalen would return, and the next day would decide not only the fate of the Nightmaw, but the future of trust itself between human and alien and beast. The language of fear. The jungle of Vereen woke heavy with mist and tension. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke from the distant campfires of Jalen's hunters. Mason stood at the edge of the ridge watching the forest move beneath a shroud of fog. Leary sat nearby with her armor plates off, staring at the Nightmaw's tracks that led toward the east. Neither spoke for a long time because words felt too small for what waited ahead. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and uncertain. She said her people would never forgive her for what she did. Mason replied that sometimes forgiveness came after understanding, and that maybe it was time they learned what the Nightmaw had been trying to say all along. They followed the fresh tracks until the forest opened, into a clearing full of shattered stone pillars and vines. Mason guessed it had once been an ancient settlement, maybe even older than Leary's people. The Nightmaw was there, lying still in the shadows, its black and blue scales catching light through the trees. Its golden eyes flicked toward them, but it did not move. Mason crouched low and waited. He began to speak in the same calm tone he had used before, soft and rhythmic, repeating short sounds that mimicked the beast's breathing pattern. Leary watched him and said she could hear the rhythm too. She hummed a single low note, matching his voice. The Nightmaw's eyes blinked once, then again, slower this time. Mason said quietly that every creature had a language of fear, and that if you could read it, you could speak. Through it, he showed Leary how to read small signs: the flick of a tail, the angle of a jaw, the twitch of muscles under skin. He said predators use these gestures to warn rather than to attack, and that humans had forgotten that once they built walls around their cities. Leary practiced beside him, copying his movements. When the Nightmaw growled low and rumbling, she backed away, but Mason held his ground and made the same sound in his throat, deep and steady. The beast stopped and tilted its head, curious. Mason said that fear was only a signal, not a weapon. Leary whispered that in her culture fear was honor, because it meant one had faced something greater than themselves. Mason looked at her and said, "Then maybe they were honoring the Nightmaw too by learning instead of killing hours passed while they observed." Mason took notes on his scanner and drew sound graphs of the beast's growls. Leary recorded the tonal patterns using her wrist device. Together they discovered that the Nightmaw's sounds were not random, but repeated in sequences almost like a song. Leary's eyes widened as she realized it might be communicating complex emotions. Mason told her humans once thought dolphins or elephants had similar structures in their calls, and that maybe this world was not so different after all. She smiled faintly for the first time since her cousin's arrival and said, "Maybe the universe wanted connection more than conquest." Later that evening, the beast rose and walked away through the ruins, leaving behind deep claw marks on one of the stone pillars. Mason traced the grooves with his fingers and found they formed a pattern that resembled spirals, not unlike ancient carvings. Leary said those symbols meant home in Old Vessian script. Mason said maybe the Nightmaw was trying to tell them something about where it lived. They followed at a distance until they reached a hollow canyon hidden behind thick vines. Inside were bones, feathers, and glimmering stones, but also something else, small tracks circling near the walls. Mason crouched and felt his pulse quicken. These were not the prints of the adult beast, but of something smaller. A soft cry echoed from the shadows like a kitten lost in a storm. Leary stepped forward carefully and saw it a cub no larger than her leg tangled in a snare made of Vessian wire. Its black fur shimmered faintly blue, just like the adult's scales. The cub whimpered and struggled weakly. Mason rushed forward, pulling out a field cutter from his belt. Leary hesitated, saying the mother would kill them if they touched it. Mason said the cub would die if they did nothing. He cut the wire gently, freeing the small creature. It stumbled and fell into his hands, trembling. He spoke softly to calm it, pressing his forehead gently against its head. The cub stopped shaking and stared at him with wide amber eyes. Leary watched this in silence, her heart racing. Every instinct told her this was blasphemy to touch the offspring of a Nightmaw, but the sight of the small creature bleeding and helpless broke through every wall she had been taught to build. She knelt beside Mason and helped bandage the cub's leg with a strip from her sleeve. For the first time, human and Vess worked side by side, not as hunter and alien, but as two beings united by care. When they finished, the cub gave a small chirping sound and pressed its nose to Mason's arm. Leary could not believe what she was seeing. She whispered that no legend had ever spoken of young Nightmaws showing affection. Mason said maybe no one ever gave them a reason to. As the sun dipped low, the forest filled with the hum of approaching engines. Jalen's hunting skiffs were returning sooner than expected. Leary's blood ran cold. She told Mason they had to hide. He picked up the cub and nodded. They ducked into a narrow crevice just as the ships passed overhead. Through the gap, they saw bright lures dropping into the clearing. Jalen's voice echoed through the speakers, calling the beast by name in mockery, promising glory to whoever brought its head. The air filled with the screech of firebombs igniting. Flames raced across the canyon floor. The adult Nightmaw appeared at the far edge, roaring in fury. It saw the cub in Mason's arms and froze. The creature's eyes flared with anguish and rage. Mason stepped forward despite the heat and smoke, holding the cub high. He shouted over the noise, telling the beast they meant no harm, that they had saved its young. The Nightmaw growled and took a step closer, nostrils flaring. Leary grabbed Mason's arm, pleading for him to stop, but he shook free and kept talking, his voice low, calm and firm. The beast lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with his. It sniffed the air, then let out a rumbling exhale that blew ash around them. Mason gently placed the cub on the ground between them. The adult nuzzled the small one, and then turned its head toward Mason, pressing its snout briefly against his chest. Leary gasped because the gesture was not one of attack but of recognition. Then the sound of new engines cut through the smoke. Jalen's main craft was descending, its wings glowing red with heat. Leary shouted that he had brought firebomb lures to burn the entire nesting ground. Mason's face hardened as realization struck. The Nightmaw roared and spread its wings to shield the cub. Leary raised her rifle toward the sky, firing at the incoming drones, but there were too many. Mason grabbed a canister from his pack and threw it into the fire, where it burst into a thick cloud of smoke, creating cover. Through the haze, they dragged the injured cub and the wounded adult toward the stream nearby. Mason's lungs burned, but he did not stop, even as sparks rained down from above. When they finally reached the water, the Nightmaw collapsed, its scales charred. Mason knelt beside it, pouring water over its wounds. Leary stood beside him, panting, watching the sky burn. Above them, Jalen's voice roared through the comms calling them traitors, and promising that at dawn he would finish what his ancestors began. The signal cut off, leaving only the sound of the river and the soft cry of the cub. Mason looked up at Leary and said quietly that dawn would bring the end unless they changed the story forever. The adult Nightmaw opened one golden eye and looked at them both as if it understood. Leary felt tears burn her eyes as she realized they had crossed the line between myth and truth, and there was no going back now. Fire and choice. Night burned red across the horizon and smoke rolled over the valley like a living sea of heat. Mason and Leary crouched beside the wounded Nightmaw near the stream, where the cool mist rose around them. The cub whimpered softly as Mason wrapped its leg with strips of his torn jacket. Leary's face was streaked with ash and fear, yet her eyes burned with defiance. Above them, the sound of engines filled the sky. Jalen's hunting craft circled closer and closer. Mason knew that the next strike would finish what the firebombs had started. He touched the side of the beast's face and whispered that they needed to move. Leary helped him lift the cub, and they began dragging both creatures deeper into the canyon, where the rocks might give them cover. The air shimmered with heat waves. Trees crackled and fell. Mason's body screamed with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. He said that if the fire reached the nest, everything would die and that he would not let that happen. Leary stumbled beside him, carrying the cub in her arms. Her people had trained her to kill Nightmaws, but now she was fighting to save one, and she could not understand why her heart hurt in ways that had nothing to do with fear. They reached a bend in the river where the current ran strong. Mason splashed water onto the Nightmaw's wounds. The beast gave a low moan but did not resist. Leary placed the cub beside it, and for a moment all three stood together, surrounded by the smell of smoke and burning life. Mason looked at her and said that survival was not about winning, but about choosing who you became when everything burned. Suddenly the ground shook as explosions echoed through the canyon. Mason turned to see lights moving through the smoke. Jalen's hunting team had arrived on foot, armed with plasma rifles and sonic traps. Leary pulled her weapon, but Mason pushed it down, saying that killing them would only prove Jalen right. Jalen stepped out of the haze, his armor gleaming red from reflected fire. He looked at Leary and shook his head, saying she had shamed their house by siding with beasts and humans. Leary shouted that he was the one who shamed them by burning life to prove power. Jalen ignored her and raised his rifle at the wounded Nightmaw. Mason stepped in front of it, his arms wide, his voice calm but firm, saying that this creature was not just an animal. It had shown empathy, it had chosen not to kill when it could have. Jalen sneered and said that empathy did not feed armies or build empires. The air between them vibrated with heat and hatred. Leary took a step toward her cousin and said that power meant nothing if it destroyed the very world they lived on. Jalen laughed bitterly and said she sounded like a human. Mason said maybe sounding human was not an insult, but a reminder that every species had the chance to rise beyond fear. Jalen's expression hardened. He ordered his soldiers to ready the plasma lances. Mason saw the reflection of blue fire in the water and knew they had seconds. He shouted to Leary to take the cub and run. She refused, saying she would not leave him. The adult Nightmaw rose behind them, trembling but standing, its wings half spread. Its roar cut through the chaos, louder than the fire itself. The soldiers hesitated. Jalen screamed for them to fire. The first volley hit the rock, sending shards flying. Mason pulled Leary down behind a boulder. The cub cried out, and the Nightmaw lunged forward, taking the full blast across its side. The air filled with burning light and dust. When the glow faded, the beast was still standing, though its flank smoked. Mason ran to it, shouting for Leary to cover him. She fired short bursts to keep the soldiers back. The Nightmaw lowered its head and nudged Mason toward the river, as if telling him to go. He shook his head and poured water on its wounds again, saying he would not leave it to die. Leary turned and saw Jalen charging toward her with his spear raised. She blocked the strike with her rifle, and the two clashed in a blur of sparks and screams. Their fight was brutal and desperate. Jalen shouted that she had forgotten who she was. Leary answered that she had finally remembered what it meant to be alive. She drove the butt of her rifle into his chest, but he countered and knocked her to the ground. Mason tried to reach them, but the Nightmaw stepped between him and the soldiers, roaring with such force that the flames bent backward in the wind. The cub squealed and ran to Leary, curling at her side. Jalen looked down at them both, breathing hard, and said that she had chosen her death. He raised his weapon for the final strike. Before he could strike, a deafening crack split the air as the Nightmaw hurled its massive body forward, slamming into Jalen and sending him tumbling across the stones. The beast stood over Leary, its body glowing faintly blue through the ash. Jalen staggered to his feet, bleeding but still defiant. He shouted that he would call an orbital strike if he had to. and that at dawn the valley would burn until nothing lived. He stumbled back toward his shuttle, leaving behind scorched earth and the promise of death. Mason rushed to Lyrie and helped her up. She was trembling but alive. The Nightmaw sagged to its knees from exhaustion. Mason said they had one night to prepare. They gathered what they could from the wreckage of Mason's gear and Lyrie's dropped packs. Mason began building small reflective panels from broken armor and foil to disrupt targeting sensors. He taught Lyrie how to layer wet leaves and smoke to hide heat signatures. She watched him work and realized that everything about humans came down to adaptation. They did not conquer with claws or fangs, but with thought and courage. As they worked, she asked why he was risking his life for a creature that was not even his own species. Mason said because humanity had once stood where this creature stood, hunted and feared, until someone chose compassion instead of dominance, and that choice changed the world. Lyrie listened quietly and said, maybe compassion was the rarest form of strength. By midnight the fires had died down, and the valley glowed dimly under the twin moons of Virene. Mason checked the charge on his remaining explosives, enough to collapse a ridge if needed. Lyrie sat beside the Nightmaw and the cub, whispering in her native tongue songs of healing once sung to warriors who returned from battle. The Nightmaw's breathing slowed, its great golden eyes blinking at her with something that looked like understanding. Mason sat beside her and said softly that dawn would bring war again, but this time they would not fight as prey or predator, but as allies. The wind carried the distant hum of Jalen's approaching ships. Mason tightened the straps of his harness and handed Lyrie a small detonator. He said that if he fell, she would need to finish what they started to save the valley and the beasts. She shook her head and said that he would not fall because the Nightmaw had chosen him. They both turned toward the ridge where the first pale light of dawn began to break through the smoke. The Nightmaw rose once more, its body trembling but ready, its cub pressed close at its side. Mason looked up at the sky and whispered that it was time to stand for something greater than fear, and the light of dawn burned across his face as the battle for life began anew. The stand at dawn, the first rays of dawn broke through the thick haze above, the valley casting streaks of gold across the ash and smoke. Mason stood at the ridge with his jacket torn and his hands raw from work. Beside him, Lyrie tightened the straps of her armor and checked the charge on her rifle, though both of them knew this morning was not about weapons, but about will. The Nightmaw stood behind them, its wings half folded, its scales still glowing faintly from the heat of battle. The cub pressed close to its mother, making soft growls that sounded more like questions than fear. The silence before the storm was heavy. Mason could hear his own heartbeat and the faint hum of Jalen's ships drawing near from the north. He turned to Lyrie and said this was their moment to prove that trust meant more than bloodlines. She nodded, her eyes hard with resolve but her voice low with sorrow. She said if they failed this day, her people would turn the entire planet into a wasteland. Mason looked toward the rising sun and said, then they could not fail. The ground began to tremble as Jalen's skiffs cut through the mist engines roaring. Lines of Vessian hunters advanced behind them in perfect formation, weapons raised. They moved like a single machine, and at their head was Jalen himself, his armor scarred from the last fight, his face filled with fury. He shouted for the human and the traitor to step aside, that the Nightmaw's death would mark the rebirth of House Vess. Mason shouted back that rebirth built on slaughter was still decay. His voice echoed through the canyon. The soldiers hesitated, unused to hearing defiance from prey. Jalen sneered and raised his arm, signaling for the drones to advance. The air shimmered as metal spheres rose from the ships, each one armed with plasma lances. Mason whispered to Lyrie to remember the plan, and she nodded, disappearing into the smoke. The drones scanned the ridge, searching for heat signatures, but Mason had spent the night covering the ground with reflective foil and damp foliage. The sensors flickered uncertain. The machines began to misfire, hitting trees and rocks. Mason moved among the chaos like a shadow, his every motion deliberate and quiet. When he reached the main beacon tower, he pulled a cable free and jammed a signal disruptor into its port. Sparks flew as the control network shorted out. The drones lost coordination and drifted into each other, crashing like blind insects. Jalen shouted in rage, ordering his hunters to fire manually. Plasma bolts cut through the haze, scorching the air. Mason ducked behind a boulder and shouted for Lyrie to signal the Nightmaw. She answered with a short pulse from her wristband, and the great beast moved. The Nightmaw leapt from the shadows with a roar that shook the very air. Its wings unfurled wide, scattering dust and light. The soldiers fired, but the beams reflected off the creature's scales in blinding bursts. The cub darted between rocks, staying close to Leary, who moved like water weaving through the chaos. She raised her rifle, but not to kill. Instead, she aimed at the drones near the cliffs, firing at their supports. The explosions triggered small landslides, sending rubble crashing down to block the hunters' advance. Mason joined her, placing charges along the ridgeline. When they detonated, the ground trembled and a wall of dust rose, cutting off Jalen's troops from their forward units. Mason turned to Leary and said this was it. The ravine trap was ready. She pressed the final trigger and the center of the valley erupted in thunder. The ledge collapsed into the ravine below, dragging several drones and vehicles down with it. The roar of falling metal drowned out the cries of the soldiers. Mason stood panting, his chest heaving as the dust cleared. The plan had worked just as he hoped, without killing anyone, only trapping them below. The Nightmaw stood beside him, its body towering like a mountain, its golden eyes gleaming with fierce light. The hunters stared in awe, their weapons lowering one by one. Jalen looked around, furious, shouting for them to keep fighting. But the sight before them was not war anymore, it was something sacred. The human, the alien, and the predator, standing together not as enemies but as kin of survival. Jalen raised his weapon again, pointing it directly at Mason. He shouted that this was an illusion, that the human had bewitched them. Mason did not move. He said that what stood before them was proof that every species could rise above fear if they only listened. He took a slow step forward and extended his hand palm open, showing no weapon, no threat. The Nightmaw mirrored his motion, lowering its head slightly beside him as if echoing the gesture. The cub squeaked softly from behind Leary, and for a brief instant even the fire in the air seemed to hold its breath. Mason said this world did not need more blood to prove courage, it needed hearts willing to understand. Jalen's face twisted with conflict, his fingers trembling on the trigger. Leary stepped forward, her voice carrying across the silence. She declared the ancient right of witness, an oath older than House Vess itself, which demanded that all warriors lower their. The battlefield lay quiet under the pale light of dawn. Smoke drifted upward in thin ribbons, carrying the last echoes of war away from the valley. Mason stood in the center of the shattered ridge, his clothes torn and his hands blackened from ash. The Nightmaw stood beside him, breathing slow and heavy, its scales dull but alive. Leary approached through the haze, her armor cracked and her hair loose around her shoulders. Behind her, the surviving Vessian soldiers lowered their weapons, uncertain of what came next. Jalen was still there, standing among the ruins, his weapon trembling in his hand, his eyes filled with confusion and fury. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence itself seemed sacred after so much noise. Then Jalen broke it. His voice hoarse and bitter, he shouted that none of it mattered, that one beast tamed by trickery did not change the truth that humans were deceivers and that Leary had betrayed her people. Mason stepped forward slowly and said that if truth frightened them, maybe it was because it was stronger than lies. He told Jalen that fear had ruled both their species for too long and that it was time to build something better. Jalen laughed harshly, saying that the only thing humans built were graves. He lifted his weapon again and aimed it at the Nightmaw's cub, who stood near Leary's feet, staring up with wide golden eyes. Leary's heart froze. She moved without thinking, placing herself between the cub and the gun. The world seemed to hold its breath. Mason raised a hand and spoke calmly, his voice steady as stone. He told Jalen that every great change began with someone choosing not to pull the trigger. He said that humanity had once lived in darkness, fighting everything it did not understand, until someone decided that even a wolf could become a friend. He spoke of the first horses tamed, the first fires shared, the first treaties signed under starlight between enemies who once only dreamed of death. He said this moment was no different. Leary's shoulders trembled, but she held her ground, her rifle hanging useless at her side, her eyes wet but fearless. The cub pressed against her leg, trembling. The adult Nightmaw took a step forward, lowering its head beside her, and releasing a deep sound that resonated through the stones. It was not a growl, but a tone like a vow. The soldiers looked to Jalen, waiting for orders, but something had changed. The rage on his face was cracking, replaced by doubt. The sight of his cousin standing unarmed beside a creature that should have killed her shattered something inside him. He shouted that it was a lie, that beasts could not love, that humans could not be trusted, that tradition was all they had left. Mason shook his head and said that tradition without compassion was just fear wearing armor. Leary took a step closer to her cousin and said that she was not betraying her people, but saving them from becoming extinct in spirit. She told him that the Nightmaw had not chosen death when it had the power to kill. It had chosen to protect even those who hunted it. She said maybe that was the lesson their ancestors had failed to learn. Jalen's hand shook the barrel of his weapon, wavering. The soldiers behind him began to lower their rifles one by one. The air felt alive with possibility. Mason kept speaking his tone like a teacher, not a warrior. He said that every world reached a point when it had to decide between dominance and coexistence. He told them he had studied hundreds of species, and that only those who learned balance survived their own evolution. The wind shifted, carrying his words through the valley like a quiet prayer. The nightmaw turned its massive head toward him and then toward Lyrie, its eyes soft and deep, as if it understood the meaning of the moment. Slowly it lowered itself to the ground, pressing its forehead gently against Lyrie's. The gesture was ancient in Vessian culture, a sign of acceptance and unity. Gasps rose among the soldiers. Mason watched as Lyrie placed her hand against the beast's scales, whispering something in her native tongue, a word that meant both gratitude and family. Jalen's weapon fell to his side, his face pale and lost. He turned away, shouting in frustration, firing a single shot into the air before dropping his rifle into the dirt. He said nothing more as he walked toward the edge of the battlefield, disappearing into the smoke. No one followed. The soldiers looked to Lyrie now not as a traitor but as a leader. She straightened and said that this valley would no longer be a hunting ground. It would be a sanctuary for both her people and the beasts of Vereen. Mason nodded and said they would record everything and share it with the council of both species. Together they began marking the ground where the fight had ended, setting small beacons to map the coordinates. The nightmaw watched them with calm curiosity, the cub darting playfully around their feet. It was the first time the valley had heard laughter in generations. Later that day, Mason set up his recorder by the river. Lyrie stood beside him, holding the cub in her arms. The adult nightmaw rested nearby, its wounds healing slowly in the sunlight. Mason dictated the first entry for the interspecies archive of Vereen. He spoke of the Battle of the Ridge, the ceasefire, and the first documented act of cooperative behavior between human, Vessian, and nightmaw. Lyrie added her own statement declaring that House Vess would bear witness to the change, and that those who opposed it would have to answer to history. They named the adult nightmaw Bright Shadow for the way its body glowed between light and dark. They named the cub Ember Swift because even in the ashes it carried the spark of new life. As the sun dipped low, Mason and Lyrie stood on the ridge looking out over the valley. The air was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of other creatures awakening in peace. Lyrie said that her people would take time to believe, but that time was something they finally had. Mason smiled faintly, saying that all great stories began with disbelief. She looked at him and asked what humanity would call this story. He thought for a long moment and said perhaps they would call it the day fear learned to bow. The words made her smile, and for the first time since her arrival on this moon she felt hope not as an idea but as a living thing. Night fell gently across Vereen. The stars came out bright and countless. Bright Shadow stood watch at the edge of the clearing while Ember Swift chased fireflies across the grass. Lyrie sat beside Mason near the fading fire. She asked him what he would do now that his mission had changed. He said he would stay as long as it took to help her people understand, and to make sure the Nightmaws had the chance to thrive again. She nodded and said then she would stay too because some bridges must be guarded until they are strong enough to stand on their own. Mason looked at her and said that maybe someday people would tell the story of the woman who walked with monsters and found family instead. Lyrie laughed softly and said, maybe they would tell the story of the man who taught monsters to trust us. The flames died down, the nightmaw lifted its head and released one final call, a low haunting sound that echoed through the valley like a song. It was not a cry of warning or grief, but of belonging. The sound rolled over the hills, reaching the farthest forests as if declaring that something had changed forever. Mason and Lyrie listened in silence, their hands resting against the ground, feeling the vibration through the earth. When the echo faded, the moonlight spilled across their faces and the cub settled between them, its eyes closing in peace. The war was over, the legend remade, and the future of two species born from respect instead of fear. In that quiet dawn of a new world, humanity and Vess both found something they had lost for ages, a home not just shared, but understood.